Two rose bushes. Same variety, bought the same afternoon from the same garden center, planted the same weekend, a few short steps apart in the same bed. Same sun, same rain, same soil. And yet, by the middle of summer, one of them has become a tall, leafy fountain. It throws out one flush of blooms, rests, then throws out another. The bush right beside it is short, scraggly, half bare, pushing out one thin, apologetic flower and calling it a season. Same everything. So what on earth happened to the second one? Here is the part nobody tells you. The gap between those two bushes was never about the rose. It was about a handful of small things the first bush was given, down at the roots and in the soil, that the second one never was. None of them cost more than a few dollars. Most of them cost nothing at all. And I am going to make you a promise. By the time we are through, you will be able to walk up to any rose, yours, your neighbor's, the sad one out front of the hardware store, and read it like a page. You will see, at a glance, exactly which of these it has been missing. This is not the tired old give it sun and prune in spring advice you have heard 1,000 times and could recite in your sleep. You have grown roses. You do not need the beginner's pamphlet read back to you. This is the quieter, mechanical truth underneath. The reason one rose races ahead, while the one beside it just sits there, year after year. And the fourth one on this list. The fourth one is going to feel completely wrong. It feels like you are sabotaging your own plant, like you are working against the very thing you set out to grow. It is also one of the most powerful things you will ever do for a rose. Wait for it. Let us go find out what the bigger bush knew. Before we so much as touch a pair of pruners or a bag of feed, we have to talk about a decision that gets made before your rose has even woken up for the year. How deep it sits in the ground. Most roses you bring home from the garden center are grafted. A flowering variety you actually wanted has been joined onto a tough, hardy rootstock, chosen for its strong roots. The place where the two were married together is that swollen, knuckled lump down near the base, the bud union. And where that lump sits, relative to the soil line, quietly decides how fast your rose will grow for the rest of its life. Here is the mechanism, because the why matters more than the rule. Leave that union sitting high and exposed, the way a great many roses get planted without a second thought, and it bakes in the sun and dries in the wind. A stressed union is slow to heal, slow to push out the strong new canes that build a bush. So the plant idles in low gear through its first year, sometimes its first two, just trying to hold on. Tuck it where it belongs, and the opposite happens. The union stays sheltered, the graft heals quickly, and the plant stops spending its strength on survival and pours it into growth instead. So here is the rule, and it bends with your climate. In mild, warm regions, set the rose so the bud union sits right at the soil line, or just barely beneath it. In colder country, anywhere winter has real teeth, bury it deeper, a couple of inches under, to shelter that joint from the frost. The growers at David Austin Roses, who have been doing this longer than most of us have been alive, plant the union below the surface for exactly this reason. And there is a quiet bonus almost nobody mentions. When you bury that union, the flowering half of the rose will often, over a few seasons, begin to send out roots of its own, growing down alongside the rootstock. It does not always happen, and it is never overnight. But a rose that comes to stand on its own roots is frequently the toughest, longest-lived rose in the whole garden. Planting depth is not a fussy little detail for the experts. It is the foundation every single thing after this is built on. Now let us fix the one habit that is quietly throttling more roses than anything else in this whole list: the way we water. The instinct, and it is a kind one, is to grab the hose or the can and shower the whole plant from above. Leaves, flowers, all of it. It feels generous. It feels like giving the rose a good, cooling drink on a hot afternoon, and it is holding your rose back in two separate ways at once. The first is underneath. A light sprinkle over the top only ever wets the top inch of soil. And if the water never goes deep, the roots have no reason to chase it down. You end up with a shallow, timid root system that dries out the moment you miss a day. And shallow roots can never drive fast top growth. What the rose wants instead is a long, slow soak right at the base. Water deeply, then wait. Let the soil dry a little before the next one. That is how you teach roots to dive, and deep roots are the engine behind every fast-growing rose there is. The second way is up in the leaves, and this is the one people miss entirely. Every time you splash water across the foliage and leave it sitting there, you are rolling out the welcome mat for black spot, that fungal disease that turns rose leaves yellow and strips them bare by August. And here is the piece that makes it matter. The plant pathologists at Penn State Extension and at the University of Maine will tell you the same thing. The black spot spore cannot infect a dry leaf. It needs the leaf to stay wet for about 7 hours straight before it can take hold. 7 hours. That is the whole game. Keep the leaves dry, deny it those 7 hours, and the disease simply has no door to walk through. Why does that decide how fast a rose grows? Because the leaves are the plant's solar panels. A rose carrying a full coat of healthy green leaves is running its engine at full power, building all the sugar it needs to grow. A rose that has lost half its leaves to black spot is running on half an engine, and you can watch it fall behind. So keep the water down at the roots, where the rose actually drinks. Keep the leaves dry. And if you ever do water from overhead, do it early in the morning, so the rising sun dries everything off fast. Dry leaves are growing leaves. Here is where the rose breaks the rule that holds for almost everything else in your garden. Most plants resent being overfed. You push too much at them and they sulk, or flop, or burn. Roses are the glorious exception. A rose is a glutton, flat-out greedy, and a hungry rose simply cannot grow fast, no matter what else you do for it. If yours is pale, slow, and stingy with its flowers, there is a very good chance it is not sick. It is just plain hungry. So feed it, and feed it on a rhythm. A balanced rose feed, as the new growth wakes up in spring, and then again right after that first big flush of bloom, to fuel the next one. The American Rose Society, the folks who have been keeping the records on this for over a century, will tell you the same. Roses are heavy feeders, and they reward steady, sensible feeding more than almost any other plant you can grow. But here is the trick that separates the people growing decent roses from the people growing the monsters that stop the neighbors in their tracks. And it is an old Rose Society secret that has somehow never left that world. Alfalfa. Plain alfalfa meal, or the pellets. The very same dried hay they sell down at the farm store as animal feed, for a few dollars a sack. Now why on earth would dried hay do anything for a rose? Because alfalfa carries a natural compound called triacontanol, and triacontanol is a genuine plant growth stimulant. It was first identified in alfalfa nearly a century ago, and it works almost like a signal, a little wake-up call. What it is especially good at is triggering what rose growers call basal breaks. Those thick, strong new canes that come shooting straight up out of the very base of the plant. Those are the canes that rebuild a rose and make it bigger. A bush that throws several of them in one season looks like an entirely different plant come autumn. I will be honest with you, the way this channel always is. When researchers took triacontanol out to the open field to measure it precisely, the results were all over the map. Some dramatic, some barely there. So I am not going to hand you a magic number. What I will tell you is that generations of rose people have scratched a few handfuls of alfalfa into the soil around the base, or steeped it in a bucket of water to make a tea, and poured that on, and watched their roses answer with fresh canes. It is cheap, it is old, and it works often enough that the people who know roses best have never let it go. Feed the glutton richly. Slip in the alfalfa. You have given the rose both the fuel and the signal to grow. This is the one I told you to wait for, and I need you to stay with me, because everything in you is going to want to argue. To make your rose grow faster and bloom more, you sometimes have to take its flowers away from it. Sometimes the very first flowers of the season, the ones you have been waiting all spring to finally see. I know precisely how that sounds. You bought a rose to get roses, and here I am, telling you to cut them off before you have even enjoyed them. It feels like sabotage. I felt that way the first time someone told me to. Here is why it is, in fact, the smartest thing you can do. And once you see the mechanism, it will change how you treat the plant forever. A rose does not flower for you. From the plant's own point of view, a flower has exactly one job: to be pollinated, fade, and swell into a seed pod, what we call a hip. And the moment a rose sets a hip, a powerful signal goes through the whole plant that says, in effect, mission accomplished. We made our seed. We can rest now. Growth slows. New flowers stop coming. As far as the rose is concerned, the year's work is done. So when you let those spent blooms sit on the bush and ripen into hips, you are, quite literally, telling your rose to stand down. Now turn it around. When you snip off each bloom the moment it begins to fade, cutting it back to a healthy set of leaves before it can ever form a hip, that mission accomplished signal never arrives. The rose stays convinced it still has work to do, so it keeps pushing. Fresh growth. A whole new round of buds. That, and not some secret fertilizer, is the real reason regular deadheading makes a rose bloom in waves all season long, instead of once and then quitting. And here is the harder, braver version for a young or newly planted rose. In that first year, pinch the flower buds off before they even open. Yes, give up the blooms entirely that one season, because every scrap of energy the plant is not spending on flowers and seed goes straight down into building roots, canes, structure. You trade 1 year of so-so flowers for a vigorous, deep-rooted powerhouse that will outgrow and outbloom its neighbors for the next decade. Stealing the flowers feels backwards, right up until the moment you watch the plant explode. That is the one almost nobody believes, until they try it once and never stop. If stealing the flowers made you nervous, this one is going to test your nerve outright. Because the single most common way good gardeners hold their roses back is by being too gentle with the pruners. It comes from a kind place. We are afraid of hurting the plant, of cutting away too much, so we give the bush a timid little trim, nipping the tips, tidying the edges, and we step back feeling like we have been careful and kind. And the rose answers that timid cut with weak, twiggy, tired growth, because a soft prune sends a soft signal. Roses are built to be cut hard. A bold prune does not weaken a rose. It wakes it up. When you cut a cane well back, you are taking all of that big root system's stored energy and pouring it into far fewer growing points. And the plant answers with thick, strong, fast new shoots, instead of a thin and crowded tangle. So in late winter or very early spring, before the rose has fully woken, prune it with conviction. On most modern bush roses, you can take off a good share of last year's growth, and the plant will thank you for it. But cut with intention, because where you cut matters as much as how much. Make each cut just above a bud that points outward, away from the center of the bush. That bud becomes your new shoot, and because it faces out, it grows outward, opening the plant into the shape of a vase, with a clear and airy middle. And that open center is doing real, quiet work. It lets light pour deep into the plant, and it lets air move through, which keeps the leaves dry, which, as we just learned, keeps the black spot out. While you are in there, take out anything dead, anything thinner and weaker than a pencil, and any two branches crossing and rubbing on each other. Be brave with the pruners. The rose is not asking you to be careful. It is asking you to be decisive. Now, before we go below ground, because the next handful are all about the soil, where this race is really won, let me hand you something to keep. Everything we have covered, and everything still coming, the right planting depth for your climate, the watering, the feeding rhythm, the alfalfa, the honest year 1 to year 3 of what to expect, I have gathered onto a single page. A field guide you can tape inside the shed door, or tuck in with your gloves, so it is right there the next time you are standing over a rose wondering what it needs. Point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and the page is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for, no email to leave behind. Then come right back, because the next 4 tricks are the ones almost nobody thinks of as rose care at all, and they may be the most important of the lot. Here is where we stop tending the rose and start tending the ground it stands in. Because everything from here down is the real heart of this, the part the seed catalogs and the bright bottles quietly trained us all to forget. A rose's roots are fussier about one thing than almost anything else: stability. They want steady, even moisture, and a steady, cool temperature. And bare soil, soil left naked to the weather, gives them neither. It bakes bone dry in a heat wave, then floods in a downpour. It swings hot by day and cold by night. Every one of those swings is a small shock, and a shocked root system keeps pausing its growth instead of running on, steady and strong. The fix is older than any of us, and almost free. Cover the ground. Lay a generous blanket of organic mulch over the soil around your rows. Well-rotted compost, shredded bark, leaf mold, whatever you can get your hands on. If you can, put down a thin layer of compost first, right on the soil, and then cap it with a couple of inches of coarser mulch on top. Just keep all of it pulled back an inch or two from the stems themselves so the base of the plant can breathe. That blanket is doing 4 jobs at once. It evens out the temperature, so the roots grow without interruption. It holds the moisture in, so they stay evenly watered between soakings instead of swinging from drowned to parched. It smothers the weeds that would otherwise steal water and food right out from under your hungry rows. And this is the one that matters most. As it slowly breaks down, it feeds the living soil underneath it. Which brings us to the trick hiding inside the trick. Here is the secret the whole channel is built on, said as plainly as I can say it. A rose does not really eat fertilizer. Not directly. What a rose actually feeds on is what the living things in the soil hand to its roots. Beneath every healthy rose is a whole invisible livestock, bacteria, fungi, and the rest, quietly working. And the most remarkable of them are the mycorrhizal fungi. These are threads finer than any root hair, and they wrap themselves around and into a rose's roots in a partnership older than the rose family itself. The rose feeds them a little sugar. In return, they reach out into the soil far beyond where the roots themselves can go, and they ferry back water and nutrients, phosphorus especially, that the rose could never have reached on its own. They are, in effect, a second root system, 10 times the size, working for free. The soil scientists at the land-grant universities and the federal soil health labs have spent decades on this, and the lesson keeps coming back to the same place. You do not feed the rose. You feed the soil, and you let the soil feed the rose. So how do you feed that invisible livestock? You have already started with the last trick. Compost and organic mulch are exactly what those fungi and bacteria live on. Every handful of finished compost is a fresh delivery of both the food and the living organisms themselves. And the things that quietly kill them off are the things we have been taught to reach for first. Drenching the bed in harsh, fast, synthetic feed, and tilling the soil to ribbons, which tears those fungal threads apart faster than they can rebuild. Leave the soil its structure. Keep it covered. Keep it fed with compost. Do that, and the living web beneath your rose does more for its growth than any bottle on the shelf ever could, which is precisely why no bottle on the shelf will ever tell you so. This one costs nothing at all, and it is mostly about where a rose stands and how much room it has to breathe. Roses love sun, you know that. But not all sun is equal, and morning sun in particular is worth more to a rose than the same hours later in the day. Here is why. Through the night, dew settles on the leaves and sits there. A rose that catches the early light gets those leaves dried off fast, first thing. And dry morning leaves, as we keep coming back to, are leaves that black spot cannot get into. A rose tucked in a shady, still corner, where the dew lingers half the morning, is a rose left wet and vulnerable for hours. And it is not only the sun, it is the air. A rose needs air moving through it. When bushes are crammed too close together, or left so dense and tangled inside that nothing stirs in there, the leaves stay damp and the still, humid air becomes a nursery for disease. This is why the hard, open pruning from earlier matters so much, and why spacing matters when you plant. Give each rose enough elbow room that a breeze can pass clean through it. Morning light overhead, open air moving through, and a plant pruned to let both reach all the way in. That is a rose keeping its own leaves clean, its solar panels working, with nothing slowing it down. It is the cheapest trick on this list, and one of the most overlooked. Now here is one that runs exactly opposite to everything we said back at trick 3, and knowing both is the mark of someone who truly understands a rose. We spent real time on how greedy a rose is, and how richly you should feed it. All true, but there is a moment, every year, when you have to stop, and feeding past that moment can quietly undo a whole season of careful work. Here is the mechanism. When you feed a rose, you are telling it to grow, to push soft, tender new shoots. That is exactly what you want in spring and early summer. But push that signal too late into the year, and you send the plant into the first frosts of fall, covered in soft new growth that has not had time to harden off. And soft growth and a hard freeze do not mix. The cold kills those tender canes back, the plant carries the damage into winter weakened, and it limps into the next spring with ground to make up. So the old rule, the one the longtime growers keep, is simple. Stop feeding your roses well before your first expected frost. Give them a couple of months to slow down, harden their wood, and get themselves ready for winter on their own clock. The last feeding of the year is a gift. Feeding after it is a mistake wearing the costume of kindness. A rose that goes into winter hard and rested comes out of it in spring ready to run. That is how this season's restraint becomes next season's speed. And the last trick is the one that ties the whole thing together, because it is not a thing to do at all. It is a short list of things to stop doing. By now you may have noticed which famous rose tricks never showed up on this list. The coffee grounds you were told to dig in to make the soil acidic, the crushed eggshells for a quick shot of calcium, the Epsom salt that was going to make your rose bloom like it was bewitched. I left them off on purpose, because when you actually look, and Dr. Linda Chalker Scott at Washington State University has spent years doing exactly that, looking hard at the garden remedies the rest of us just repeat. Most of them do far less than the stories promise. Used coffee grounds sit close to neutral once they are brewed. They will not meaningfully sour your soil. Eggshells break down so slowly, they do almost nothing for this year's rose. They belong in the compost. And Epsom salt only helps a rose that is genuinely short on magnesium, which a simple soil test would tell you, and which most garden soil simply is not. None of these will wreck your rose, but every hour and every dollar you pour into a remedy that does almost nothing is an hour and a dollar stolen from the 9 things on this list that actually work. And here is the part worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever wondered why the things that truly grow a rose, the deep watering, the hard pruning, the compost, the living soil, are the ones nobody is selling you? It is not a conspiracy. Nobody buried this knowledge in a vault. The reason is simpler and a little sad. You cannot patent a bucket of compost. You cannot put a trademark on burying the bud union or on pulling a fading bloom before it sets a hip. You cannot sell deep watering back to a gardener every spring. The things that are free and that last have no marketing budget behind them, so they go quiet on the shelf, while the bright bottle that needs buying again next month gets the front display. The shelf was never going to remind you of the things that cost nothing. That is the one job it cannot do. So consider this your reminder. Let us go back, one last time, to those 2 rose bushes from the very beginning, the tall leafy fountain and the scraggly little thing a few steps away, in the same soil, under the same sky. You know now exactly what stood between them. The bigger bush was planted at the right depth, so its union never had to struggle. It was watered deep and dry-leaved, so disease never got its foothold. It was fed like the glutton it is, with a quiet hit of alfalfa to spark new canes. Its first flowers were taken before they could set hips, so it never once believed its work was finished. It was cut hard and open to the light, and underneath it all, its roots lay calm beneath a blanket of mulch, in living soil full of working life. The little one beside it was given none of that. I will tell you something, before I let you go. For years, I was the one growing the little bush. I fed it from the brightest bottle on the shelf. I watered it from over the top, because that felt like love, and I left it sitting in bare, tired ground. And then I quietly blamed myself, year after year, for a brown thumb I did not actually have. What finally turned it around for me was not a better product. It was the day I stopped trying to feed the rose and started tending the few inches of soil underneath it. The plant had been telling me what it needed the whole time. I just had not learned how to listen. That is really what all 10 of these come down to. Not a cabinet full of miracle cures, just the patience to give a rose the handful of plain things it is actually asking for, and the quiet faith to feed the soil, and let the soil do the rest. If that is the kind of gardener you already are, or the kind you would like to grow into, then you are among friends here. This is a place for people who would rather understand their garden than be sold to. Subscribe, and let us keep tending the old, honest way, together, one season at a time. I will see you out among the roses.